This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order Wilds of Eldraine, you can use my link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and I'm continuing today with my Wilds of Eldraine set review. So far I've looked at every multicolored white and blue card, and today we're going to continue with black. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll play in Limited, and I'll sum up my thoughts by using a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find out what my grades mean by looking in the description. A couple of things to keep in mind as we look at these cards. First, I'm only evaluating these cards for Limited play and not any other formats. That means I'm only talking about cards that can be found in draft boosters. Also keep in mind these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, so I of course won't be right about everything. I will be providing updates about the format here on the channel as I play it more and more. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, you'll also have a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, without further ado, let's take a look at the first black card in my Wilds of Eldraine limited set review. And we're starting with a pretty impressive one. It's Ashyox Wicked Manipulator, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 5 loyalty legendary planeswalker Ashyox at Mythic Rare. It says, if you would pay life while your library has at least that many cards in it, exile that many cards from the top of your library instead. The +1 says, look at the top 2 cards of your library, exile one of them and put the other into your hand. The -2 says, create 2 1/1 black nightmare creature tokens with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if a card was put into exile this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And there's a -7 that says target player exiles the top X cards of their library, where X is the total mana value of cards you own in exile. This looks amazing. The first part of the card is almost never going to come up, and I think in some situations it'll even feel like a downside, even with the fact that Ashyox -2 and -7 both like it when you exile things. But it's okay that that's the case because the other abilities are incredibly good. The +1 is a great card draw effect, especially because it will help grow the 2/2s that the -2 makes, and the -2 is good on its own as well, as having Ashyox come down and make those 2 bodies will often do enough to keep Ashyox around for a while, especially because those tokens are just going to grow every turn going forward. And remember, they do it during combat, so it can happen pretty quickly. The ultimate is kind of an afterthought here, mostly because you want to get real cards with the +1, so the mana value of the cards you exile won't be that high, but there will be situations where you look at the board and just using Ashyox +1 twice to exile 2 expensive things and then fire off the -7 makes sense. So it's upside on a card that is already nuts without it. The total package here is an insane bomb. I'm giving this an A+. Next up, it's Ashyox Reaper, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 nightmare at uncommon. Whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. This is a little too clunky. The stats are bad, and while getting enchantments into the graveyard is more doable in this format than most, this is thanks to the fact that there's bargain and sagas and roll tokens. So you will be getting them into the graveyard, but it's not going to happen so often that this entirely makes up for the very real problem of being a hill giant. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Back for Seconds, an uncommon sorcery with Bargain. This means you can sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token as you cast it. It says return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. If this spell was bargained, you may put one of those cards with mana value 4 or less onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your hand. I would already be interested in having 1 copy of this in every black deck without Bargain. This type of card just always does a good job of helping you win long games by giving back your 2 best creatures from the graveyard. So, the fact that this can effectively reanimate something small when you do bargain it is pretty amazing. The format has lots of good fodder to sacrifice, including food and treasure and roll tokens, so bargaining this isn't really far-fetched at all. You still probably don't want more than 1 of these because they are pretty bad in the early game, but I think the first copy is a pretty good card. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Barrow Naughty, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/3 fairy. At common, it's got flying. It has lifelink as long as you control another fairy, and you can pay 2 generic and a black, and it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. A 2-mana 1/3 with lifelink is a solid card, and that's what this will be a decent chunk of the time, especially in blue-black. The buff effect is expensive and really only the kind of thing you use when you have nothing else to do. Overall, I think this is a C-. Next up, it's Beseech the Mirror, which for 1 generic and 3 black is a mythic rare sorcery with Bargain. Search your library for a card, exile it face down, then shuffle. If this spell was bargained, you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost if that spell's mana value is 4 or less. Put the exiled card into your hand if it wasn't cast this way. This is a tutor, and it's almost always a good idea to look at them with serious skepticism in Limited. The average power level of cards in your deck is much lower than in 60 or 99 card formats, so tutoring is already inherently weaker, but the fact most of them also don't impact the board at all is what makes them a huge liability. If you get the bargain on this going, it can affect the board, effectively grabbing whatever your best 4 or less card is from your deck and giving it to you. That gives it a better ceiling than most tutors have, but it does take some setup, and if you're just using this to tutor something up, it's going to feel absolutely awful. I mean, that card is a straight up F, super unplayable. Casting it probably loses you the game because you spent an entire turn doing it, and then you have to cast whatever you tutored up, so you know, if you bargain this, it's going to feel better than that, but it's still not going to feel that good. And even though this format does have a lot of fodder, it's still some significant setup. The fact it costs triple black matters too. Mana's just not very good and limited, so I think this is probably a C-, and it may go even lower. Next, it's Candy Grapple, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant with Bargain. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. If this spell was bargained, that creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn instead. So without Bargain, this is already premium removal that you'll always play. With it, it's probably one of Black's best commons. It can deal with so many things when you bargain, and as I've already said multiple times, there's plenty of fodder around, and the floor on this card is a lot better than something like a tutor. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Conceited Witch, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 human warlock at common. It has Menace. It also comes with an adventure called Price of Beauty. It costs 1 black. It's a sorcery. And it says create a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature you control. And with an adventure, you then exile this and you can cast a creature later from exile. You can always skip the adventure if you want to, but oftentimes in Limited, you want to cast both halves when you can, so you generate the full value this card can give you. Additionally, I'll put the Wicked Roll token on the screen here, but suffice it to say, it offers a pretty nice buff to your creature. This looks like a nice common. A 3-mana 2/3 with Menace is probably a D+ or a C-, and having the fact that you can augment this creature for only 1 mana on an earlier turn, or the same turn if you happen to have 4 mana, seems pretty nice overall. This feels like it's going to give you like a card and a half worth of value when you manage to do that, and I don't think managing to do that is insane. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Dream Spoilers, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/2 Fairy Warlock at uncommon. It has flying, and whenever you cast a spell during an opponent's turn, up to 1 target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. 4-mana 2/2s do not do well in Limited, and they haven't for a long time. This is mostly because there are multiple 1-mana spells in each set that can deal with them, and at lower rarities too. So paying 4 can often result in a massive tempo hit. And the ability here is nice, especially if you can cast multiple spells, but triggering it is far from automatic, and even when you do sometimes, it's not going to do anything. I don't really see this making the cut most of the time. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Ego Drain, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. If you don't control a fairy, exile a card from your hand. So this card is absolutely horrendous. If you don't control a fairy, you 2-for-1 yourself, which is never what you want to do in Limited. If you do control a fairy, it offers some powerful and efficient disruption, but a card like this gets a lot less impressive when you can't cast it effectively on turn 1. I mean, you can, but you're going to 2-for-1 yourself. And even a fairy deck with like 10 fairies in it is sometimes going to have this card and not have a fairy in play, especially in the early game, and that's going to still feel pretty miserable. So this has an impressive ceiling, but the floor is so abysmal and so frequently going to be what you get that I think I just have to give this an F. Next up, it's The End, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a rare instant. It costs 2 less to cast if your life total is 5 or less. Exile target creature or planeswalker. Search its controller's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the same name as that permanent and exile them. That player shuffles, then draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way. This card has a lot of text on it, but the words that really matter are exile target creature or planeswalker. In other words, this is mostly a 4-mana instant speed removal spell that can take down creatures or planeswalkers. The other 2 things are additional upside on a removal spell that's already pretty good. You know, sometimes being able to cast this for 2 in the late game is going to feel amazing. And getting information about your opponent's deck never hurts, but I also wouldn't count on actually stripping a card out of their deck when you cast this because we're talking about limited. Still, it's premium removal thanks to sort of the baseline and then having a little bit of upside. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Ariette's Whisper, which for 3 generic and a black is a common sorcery. Target opponent discards 2 cards. Create a Wicked Roll token attached up to 1 target creature you control. 4 mana to Mind Rot isn't great, even if you do get a roll out of the deal. Spending this much and adding minimally to the board is just not something you want to do in most formats. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Fairy Dream Thief, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 Fairy Warlock and uncommon. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, you surveil 1, and you can pay 2 generic and a black and exile it from your graveyard to draw a card and lose 1 life. This is an amazing 1-drop. I think I'm already in on a 1 mana 1/1 flyer that surveils 1. So the fact that this can then cash itself in from the graveyard and give you back a whole card is pretty nice. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Fairy Fencing, which for X generic and a black is an uncommon instant. Target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. That creature gets an additional -3/-3 until end of turn if you control the fairy as you cast this spell. This is great. Even without the fairy upside, this is an instant speed removal spell that scales all game long. If your deck has 0 fairies, you're always going to play this, but it gets far better if you do have some fairies around as it becomes insanely efficient. You can even pay 1 to give something -3/-3 if you do have a fairy, and there are enough fairies in black that setting this up for the extra value isn't that hard, and the baseline is a really good card, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Feed the Cauldron, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant. It says destroy target creature with mana value 3 or less. If it's your turn, create a food token. So this will never let you trade up. I mean, that's what happens when a 3 mana card can only kill things that cost 3 mana or less. And trading up is often one of the best things you can do with removal. Getting the food helps, but the fact that you only get it on your turn is kind of frustrating because I still don't think it would be a great card if it gave it to you all the time. But the fact you only get it on your turn really makes it fall short of being premium removal. It's certainly serviceable, especially if you have some food synergies, but it's probably just a C. Next up, it's Fell Horseman, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 zombie knight at common. When it dies, you put it on the bottom of its owner's library. Its adventure is Deathly Ride, which for 1 generic and a black is a sorcery. It says return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Like a lot of the common adventure creatures, both sides of this look kind of underwhelming, and they would be individually, but both halves of this do give you a card worth of value. One of them gets you a card back from the graveyard. The other one can trade for something. So it's pretty hard for this to be anything less than a C+. Even if both sides of this are kind of more than you want to pay for the effect, you do get both out of a single card, and that's powerful. Next up, it's Gumdrop Poisoner, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 human warlock at rare. It has lifelink. When it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn, and it comes with an adventure called Tempt with Treats, which for 1 black mana is an instant that gives you a food token. This is excellent. Obviously, the idea is that her food token can help set her up later in the game, and the format has plenty of other food too, so casting the Poisoner and giving something -3/-3 until end of turn isn't going to be that difficult. You do need to spend extra mana to gain that life, usually, but that type of turn is still going to feel really powerful. I'm giving her a B+. Next up, it's High Fade Negotiator, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 3/5 Fairy Warlock at uncommon. It has Bargain. It has Flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was bargained, each opponent loses 3 life, and you gain 3 life. A 5 mana 3/5 flyer is probably a C-, and turning this into Siege Rhino is going to be very doable. This Drain 3 life, enter the battlefield ability is surprisingly powerful, as the gap in life between you and your opponent is 6 as a result of this, and that drastically alters races. Then this big body can attack and block reasonably well. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Hopeless Nightmare, which for 1 black mana is a common enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life. When it is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you scry 2, and you can pay 2 generic and a black to sacrifice it. 1 mana to make your opponent discard a card and lose 2 life isn't the worst thing in the world. And the thing that's really nice about this is you can play it early to do that, and then later in the game it's great fodder for cards with Bargain, because you even get a scry trigger when you do that. It can sacrifice itself, but obviously that's the kind of effect you use in desperation when you have nothing else you can do. Hopefully you don't end up at that point ever, and you can just sack it for value to something with Bargain. I think it's kind of funny how much better this is than that Fairy discard spell, at least in Limited. That Fairy discard spell is probably going to be way better in Constructed when you can have like a gajillion fairies. But in Limited, this looks like a pretty nice little role player that you'll play one of in a lot of black decks, because most black decks will have a bunch of Bargain, giving it a C. Next up, it's Lich Knight's Conquest, which for 4 generic and a black is a rare sorcery. Sacrifice any number of artifacts, enchantments, and or tokens. Return that many creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So the idea here is to give up a bunch of expendable stuff and then reanimate some things. The problem is, even in this format, the fact you can only give up permanents of a few types is limiting, especially because this already asks for the setup cost of having something or a few somethings worth reanimating for 5 mana. I just think this is a little too finicky to make work consistently in limited, giving it a D. Next up, it's Lord Skitter Sewer King, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/3 rat noble at rare. Whenever another rat enters the battlefield under your control, exile up to 1 target card from an opponent's graveyard. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block. A 3-mana 3/3 that hates on the graveyard isn't bad, and the fact that Skitter turns out a rat every turn is pretty nuts. Even if they can't block, they give you the ability to pressure your opponent, and they provide excellent sacrifice fodder. Most of the time when you play Skitter, you're going to get at least 1 rat out of it, so it will always feel like you're coming out ahead against your opponent. And if they don't deal with Skitter, the value you can snowball out of all those rat tokens is going to overwhelm them. I think that means Skitter's a bomb, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Lord Skitter's Blessing, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you create a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature you control. At the beginning of your draw step, if you control an enchanted creature, you lose 1 life and you draw an additional card. This can give you a ton of value for 2 mana. Obviously, paying 2 mana for just the roll token isn't good, but if you can keep it or another aura around, which is very doable in this format, this starts doing the Phyrexian Arena thing on top of the fact that it added to the board. I think it's easy enough to get this to draw you enough cards that it will be fairly effective. I'm giving this a B. Next, it's Lord Skitter's Butcher, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 rat peasant at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you have 3 options. You can create a 1/1 rat token, you can sack another creature, and if you do, scry 2 and draw, or creatures you control gain menace until end of turn. This looks like a great uncommon. Each of these modes is really good, and you'll be happy to choose each of them in the right situation. If you need more bodies, you can make a token. If you need more cards, well, you can give up a rat you already have to get one. And if you've got a good board state already, you can give the whole board menace and go after your opponent. This looks like one of the better uncommons in the set, especially among the monocolored cards. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Minstrosity, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/1 common horror. And when it dies, you make a food. 2 mana 3/1s tend to be okay for aggro decks, and getting a food when this goes down is decent upside to have. Means it's okay sacrifice fodder and stuff like that. It also doesn't exactly feel like a card that will always make the cut in your black decks, though, although the fact it's a 2-drop does up the chances of that happening. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Not Dead After All, which for 1 black mana is a common instant. Until end of turn, target creature you control gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control, then create a Wicked Roll token attached to it. This is an interesting take on this type of effect since the creature gets to return with a buff, but when we see this effect completely absent of a power boost up front, it hasn't played that well. For something like this to feel really good, it has to increase the chances of your creature winning combat, and this just doesn't do that. The creature already has to win combat for this to feel like something really worth doing. I mean, it's never completely terrible or anything, because your creature will come back and it'll come back bigger. It's especially good against removal, but its weakness in combat doesn't make it a combat trick I'm all that excited about. It does get better in a world where you have enter the battlefield abilities and things like that. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Rankle's Prank, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery. It says choose 1 or more. Each player discards 2 cards. Each player loses for life. Each player sacrifices 2 creatures. This can have a huge impact on the game, and its modality means you can always choose only the things that hurt your opponent more than they hurt you. There will be situations, though, where none of these modes work very well for you, like if you're behind. So it's probably just a C. I mean, if you're ahead, this can be completely insane. If you're behind, it's probably miserable. So I think that makes it a C. Next up, it's Rat Out, which for 1 black mana is a common instant. Up to 1 target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. You create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block. The rat not being able to block here is a big deal, but if you can pick off an X1 with this while adding something to your board, that's not too bad. The problem is a 1/1 that can't block isn't exactly the most significant thing to add to your board. In fact, it's pretty close to the least significant thing you can add. So in situations where you're just getting the 1/1 out of this, and the -1/-1 doesn't really matter, it's not going to feel very good. You really need to be able to kill something or help one of your creatures kill something with this to really feel like you're getting there. We have seen a lot of these really cheap cards that do two seemingly small things overperform in Limited lately, but I think this one is still weak enough that it's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Rowan's Grim Search, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant with Bargain. If it was bargained, you look at the top 4 cards of your library, then put up to 2 of them back on top of your library in any order and the rest into your graveyard. You draw 2 and you lose 2. This is a pretty nice take on the usual black card draw spell we get. If you don't bargain, we're talking about an instant speed draw 2, lose 2, which is playable in all but the fastest of formats. If you have something expendable to bargain, you're looking at a card that lets you see a ton of cards for the cost, up to 6 of them, which is pretty impressive. It helps you load the graveyard too. Now, it is still a card that doesn't really impact the board, and you won't always want to bargain it. In fact, in terms of how much this gives you an upgrade compared to some of the other bargain cards, this one isn't that big. It's not something you're really gonna try really hard to bargain. You'll just do it when you happen to have something worthless around to throw away. So overall, I mean, you probably don't want more than 1 copy of this. I almost feel like I'd rather have the card that lets you get 2 things back from your graveyard than this too, although that is an uncommon, so you can't count on getting it as much, but I think the first copy of this is a C. Next up, it's Scream Puff, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/5 horror. At common, it's got Death Touch, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you create a food token. This is pretty beefy, although I think it would be a lot better if it made food when it entered the battlefield. That would allow it to be one of those big creatures that helps slower decks stabilize. This can still do that because it's big, and there will be board states where it can attack pretty effectively. I mean, having Death Touch on a big creature is a little awkward when you're on defense, but when you're the one attacking with a Death Touch creature this big, it does mean your opponent has to have 1 creature big enough to take it down. Otherwise, the block is going to be pretty ugly. Overall, this seems like a solid card, giving it a C. Next up, it's Shatter the Oath, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a common sorcery. Destroy target creature or enchantment. Create a Wicked Roll token attached up to 1 target creature you control. 5 mana sorcery speed removal is very clunky. It's just too expensive and too slow. You're usually not going to come out ahead when it comes to mana. But this can go after 2 card types, and it does upgrade your board a tiny bit. So it's not bad or anything. It's pretty hard for any removal spell that costs 5 or less and destroys a creature, no questions asked. It's hard for that card to be bad, but it is slow enough and clunky enough that it's probably just a C. Next up, it's Spectre of Mortality, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 Spectre. At rare, it's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile 1 or more creature cards from your graveyard. When you do, each other creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards exiled this way. So this needs some setup, but it can potentially be a wrath that it survives, and anytime a card has that potential, obviously it's pretty crazy. If it didn't have all this setup where you need to have enough cards in your graveyard and your opponent's creatures also have to be small enough that they all die to this, if it didn't have that, it would be a pretty insane bomb, obviously. Like if it just came down and destroyed everything but itself. That's a card we've seen before, and obviously that would be an A+. You aren't always going to get there with this, but it does have the added upside of even if you can't quite wipe the whole board with it, sometimes there'll be situations where your opponent has a bunch of X1s and X2s, and you don't, and you can just exile 2 things, kill a bunch of their stuff, and all of your stuff survives. So, you know, it has this one really crazy upside where you exile 5 things and kill everything but the Spectre. And then it has this more attainable mode where it just kills small things. No matter what, it survives and adds to the board while doing it. So I still think it's a bomb. It's just not an A+ bomb because the setup is pretty real. There will be situations where you run this out and it's mostly just a 5 mana 3/3 flyer, and that is bad, but overall it's still amazing, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Spiteful Hex Mage, which for 1 black mana is a 3/2 human warlock at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you create a cursed roll token attached to target creature you control. This is the only roll that does not buff something. I mean, I guess if it's a 0/1, it buffs it, but it's the one that goes onto a creature, as this reminder text tells you here, and makes it into a 1/1. So, in other words, when you play the Hex Mage, it's going to debuff one of your creatures in most cases. On its own, this is effectively a 1 mana 1/1, but getting rid of that curse isn't that hard. You can simply find a way to put another roll on the Hex Mage, or you can sacrifice it to bargain. So chances are pretty good you can find a way to get value out of getting a curse so early in the game. You, of course, also have the option later in the game to put the curse somewhere else, like on a creature that's already incapacitated in one way or another, and a 3/2 body is imposing enough that the Hex Mage is likely to usually matter. Basically, I think you can get enough mileage out of the curse and the sufficient body for this to play reasonably well, giving it a C+. Next, it's Stingblade Assassin, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/1 fairy assassin at common with flash and flying. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. This enter the battlefield ability almost always underperforms. It's just hard to consistently find a way to damage a creature without using up some resource you didn't really want to use up. It might be interesting with rat tokens because your opponent is going to be willing to block those a lot with their 2/2s or whatever, but this probably doesn't end up actually being able to destroy something often enough for it to be something that you always want to play, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Sugar Rush, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. Target creature gets +3/+0 until end of turn, draw a card. This replaces itself, but I don't love this sort of buff overall. Sure, it probably lets your creature kill something, but most of the time whenever you cast this, the thing you cast it on is probably going to die too. Drawing the card keeps you from getting 2 for 1, but it doesn't really make up for the massive tempo loss that's usually going to result. It does get better if you have things with first strike or high toughness and things like that, but most of the time the way creatures are statted, your thing will probably die, as will theirs, and you do get to draw a card, but you also lose something on board in doing so. So I think it's just a C-. Next up, it's Sweet Tooth Witch, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 human warlock at common. When it enters the battlefield, you create a food, and you can pay 2 and sack a food, and target player loses 2 life. This is a lot like Tempting Witch from original Eldraine that ended up being pretty solid, and I think this will perform similarly. Giving up food to hurt your opponent can definitely have a place in a food-centric deck, which will usually mean black-green, and it can even be a win condition. And this card's baseline is perfectly reasonable too. A 3-mana 3/2 that makes a food is probably something that'll make the cut in a lot of decks anyway, even without the additional ability. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Taken by Nightmares, which for 2 generic and 2 black is an uncommon instant. Exile target creature you control. If you control an enchantment, scry 2. Even without the enchantment part of the card, you'd always play this in your black decks. Exiling something for 4 at instant speed is just always going to be good. When you get this to scry, it'll feel a lot better. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Tangled Colony, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/2 rat at rare. It can't block, and when it dies, you create X 1/1 black rat creature tokens with this creature can't block, where X is the amount of damage dealt to it this turn. This is a pretty annoying attacker to have to deal with in basically any game. You can choose to trade with it, sure, but your opponent then gets at least 2 rat tokens, so you come out behind. So you're left with either just taking 3 at a time or losing some serious value in a trade. It also means damage-based removal spells aren't very good against the colony. There is a downside here, of course, and that is the fact that it can't block, and obviously that makes it a lot worse, because if you're behind, this kind of card is always going to feel pretty awkward. Sure, you can just rumble with it every turn, but what you really need sometimes is just a blocker that can trade, and Tangled Colony is never, ever going to be that. But this is a card that if you play it on turn 2, your opponent is going to be in like a complete nightmare scenario where no matter what they do, they're going to end up behind because Tangled Colony is either hitting them for 3 a turn, or they trade with it and give you a couple of free rat tokens. It's a weird card because it is so bad when you're behind, but it's like amazing on turn 2. It's pretty good when you're at parity, and obviously when you're ahead, it's quite good as well. Overall, I think that makes it a B. Next up, it's Twisted Sewer Witch, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 3/4 uncommon human warlock. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 black rat creature token. Then for each rat you control, create a Wicked Roll token attached to that rat. This looks like a really good uncommon. It reminds me a little of Diregraph Horde. That's good company to keep. That card was even a common, which is insane. But anyway, you pay 5 mana here for at least 5/6 worth of stats across 2 bodies, and sure, one of those bodies can't block, but that's still insane, especially because should you have any other rats around, which doesn't look that hard in black, the witch buffs all of them too. This might just be the best uncommon in the set. I think it's so good, I'm going to do something that doesn't happen very often, and maybe it's just my affinity for rats, but I'm going to give this uncommon a bomb grade. This comes down, adds significantly to the board no matter what, leaves behind real value no matter what, and there are plenty of situations where you play this and you have like 2 other rats in play and the game is just over. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Virtue of Persistence, which for 5 generic and 2 black is a mythic rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. And it also has an adventure called Lochthwain Scorn. It's a sorcery, it costs 1 generic and a black, and target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn, and you gain 2 life. So the adventure side of this on its own is just a B. Like, it's a great removal spell. Even if it's not an instant, it can trade up for a lot of things and gain you life in the process. And this is a removal spell with absolutely insane late game upside where you just play this huge enchantment that's going to snowball you to victory. Now, that huge enchantment does take a turn to get going, and there are going to be times where it's just too slow, but we're still talking about a really, really good removal spell with insane late game upside where it's also a win condition. And I think the value of that, even if the enchantment can be a little clunky sometimes, I think the value of that makes this a completely insane bomb, giving it an A+. Next up, it's Voracious Vermin, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/1 rat at common. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 black rat creature token with. This creature can't block, and whenever another creature you control dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on Voracious Vermin. 3 mana for a 2/1 and a 1/1 isn't bad, and this will be growing a lot of the time, especially in black-red when you're just throwing rats at your opponent. Just blocking those rats will make the vermin grow. Seems solid enough to me. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Warehouse Tabby, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 cat at common. Whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you create a rat token, and you can pay 1 generic and a black to give it Death Touch. So take away the enchantment part of this card, and it's pretty bad. A 1 mana 1/1 at Death Touch is solid, as it can trade with anything. This has the capacity to do that, but because you have to have mana up to do it, and because you spend extra mana to make it happen, it's way worse than a 1 mana 1/1 that always has Death Touch. The fact it can crank out rat tokens is nice, but I'm overall kind of skeptical of all of these cards that aren't already kind of a good baseline that also give you value when an enchantment goes to your graveyard, because it's going to happen in the format. Your creatures with rolls on them are going to die. You can put a second roll on a creature that already has one and get a rat token out of it. You can bargain things. There's a few sagas in the set. It's going to happen, but these cards that have such a bad baseline, like Warehouse Tabby, like 1 mana 1/1 that can gain Death Touch for 1 generic and a black is probably a D-. Like, that is a very bad baseline. So you really have to be doing something here to make up for that. And it does make up for it to some extent, but not so much that it's a card I'm ever excited about putting in my deck. I think it's more like a C-. Next up, it's Wicked Visitor, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2. It's a common nightmare, and whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So this does have a decent baseline, but the payoff isn't that exciting for your enchantments going to the graveyard. But it's not hard to imagine this being a 2 mana 2/2 that chips in a couple damage. I think that makes it fine as a 2-drop. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's the Witch's Vanity, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment saga. As with all sagas, it enters the battlefield with a lore counter. Each time it gets a lore counter, you get a chapter, and you add the subsequent lore counters after your draw step, and then when the final chapter triggers, you sacrifice the saga. So, chapter 1 here, destroy target creature an opponent controls with mana value 2 or less. Chapter 2 makes a food, and chapter 3 makes a wicked roll. This looks pretty good to me. The 3 things this does are kind of small, but it's almost always going to feel like you get about 2 cards worth of value out of it. There will be situations where chapter 1 doesn't have a target, but they're not going to be that common. Like, it's going to have something to kill on most boards, and when that's true, you're getting a card of value up front, and then the food plus the roll, I feel like it's pretty close to feeling like another card worth of value. So like most sagas, it's kind of slow. Each effect individually doesn't seem that great, but you're getting all of it for 2 mana, and I think that makes this really good, giving it a B. So that's all the black cards in Wilds of Eldraine. Tomorrow I'll be back with a look at all the red cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. And remember, if you want some set review related perks while also supporting the channel, you can become a channel member or a patron. You can find out how to do that in the description. Thanks for watching.